In 1459, across the frozen plains of Wallachia, an invisible tension hung over the air like thick fog. Vlad Tepes had consolidated his power through terror, but now he faced an enemy he couldn't impale so easily: Ottoman diplomacy. Sultan Mehmed, the Conqueror, he who had taken Constantinople just 6 years earlier, watched with growing irritation the small Christian province that dared defy his empire. Wallachia paid tribute, yes, but its voivode systematically refused what the Sultan desired most: young Wallachians to feed the elite corps of janissaries and the complete submission that came with that surrender. Vlad knew the Ottomans well, too well. Years of captivity in his youth had taught the prince not only the Turkish language but also the power games that moved that empire. He knew that every gesture had meaning, every word carried weight, and every symbol represented an unbreakable hierarchy. It was in this tense context that during the winter of that year, an Ottoman delegation crossed the snowy borders of Wallachia. They came not as conquerors, but as emissaries. They brought no armies, but proposals. And they did not bow, because they represented the power that had subjugated half the known world. The emissaries rode with the typical arrogance of those who serve the most powerful empire of the age. Their horses were magnificent, their garments refined, and upon their heads, wrapped in crimson and golden fabrics, rested the turbans. Those turbans were not simple adornments. They were symbols of faith, of tradition, of a millennial culture that stretched from the steppes of Asia to the gates of Vienna. When they arrived at the palace of Târgoviște, the Wallachian capital, guards led them through corridors where echoes of footsteps mixed with the smell of candle wax and damp wood. The stone walls guarded secrets of recent blood. The bloody Easter was still an open wound in the kingdom's collective memory. 500 boyars had been massacred there months before, and the air still carried the weight of that violence. Vlad awaited them seated on his throne, narrow eyes observing every movement, every expression, every detail. Beside him, Wallachian advisors maintained respectful silence. The prince wore black, as usual, and the dragon emblem shone discreetly on his chest. His reputation already crossed borders. The Impaler, they whispered. The man who had transformed justice into theater of horrors. The Ottoman emissaries entered the hall with firm steps. They did not bow deeply. They did not remove their turbans. They remained standing, haughty, as representatives of a power that bowed not even before Christian kings. It was a calculated gesture, a demonstration of superiority that did not go unnoticed. Vlad observed in silence. His fingers drummed lightly on the arm of the throne, an almost imperceptible gesture that his men knew well. It was the harbinger of something. It always was. The interpreter translated the formal greetings. The Ottomans had come on a diplomatic mission, bringing words from the Sultan himself. They spoke of tributes, of agreements, of peace, but their heads remained covered, and that, in that hall, was a declaration. The silence that followed was dense as molten lead. Vlad leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands interlaced. His eyes, small and penetrating, fixed on the crimson turbans that crowned the heads of the Turkish emissaries. He knew that symbol, knew its weight, its meaning, the silent declaration it represented. During years of captivity in Egregores and Adrianople, young Vlad had observed Ottoman rituals with the attention of a prisoner who knows that knowledge is survival. He had seen how the janissaries treated their superiors, how subjects behaved before the Sultan, how each gesture carried layers of meaning that only the initiated fully understood. And now, before him, emissaries of the empire that had held him hostage dared enter his hall, in his kingdom, and keep their heads covered as if they were in the presence of any vassal. As if Wallachia were just another province to be dominated, another tribute to be collected, another people to be subjugated. But Vlad was not Dan, was not Vladislav, was not any of the weak voivodes who had bowed and trembled before Ottoman power. He was the son of the dragon, he who had survived Turkish hell and returned as a storm of iron and blood. And in his kingdom, the rules would be his. The prince rose slowly. The movement was calculated, almost theatrical. Each inch he gained in height seemed to proportionally diminish the emissary's confidence. Something in Vlad's eyes, something ancient and dangerous, made even experienced warriors instinctively retreat. He descended the throne steps with measured paces, leather shoes echoing against the cold stone. He approached the Turks until he was a few steps away. Torchlight danced on his face, creating shadows that made him seem more nightmare sculpture than man of flesh. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost soft, but carried a poison that everyone in the hall could feel. He asked, in perfect Turkish, why the emissaries had not removed their coverings when entering the presence of the voivode of Wallachia. The question hung in the air like a suspended blade. The chief ambassador, a tall man with graying beard and dark eyes that had witnessed countless courts and innumerable negotiations, maintained his composure. He responded with the firmness of one who represents an empire. It was the custom of his people, he explained, to keep the turban always upon the head. It was a sacred tradition, an expression of faith and identity that transcended borders and thrones. Not even before the Sultan, the lord of the two lands and the two seas, did they remove their coverings. That was what their traditions commanded, and so it would remain. The answer was at once explanation and challenge. It was saying, "We are who we are, and not even you, prince of a small and besieged kingdom, will make us change." It was reminding Vlad that no matter how fearsome he was, he still governed a land squeezed between empires, a fragment of Christianity surrounded by the Islamic crescent that advanced implacably. Vlad heard everything in silence, did not interrupt, did not gesture, only absorbed each word like a predator studies its prey before the strike. When the ambassador finished, the prince nodded slightly, as if he understood perfectly, as if he respected that millennial tradition. Then he smiled. It was not a smile of joy or understanding. It was that kind of smile that makes blood freeze, that transforms courage into dread, that announces that something terrible is about to happen. The Wallachian guards around the hall stiffened. They knew that smile, had seen it before, moments before boyars were impaled, before merchants were burned, before entire worlds collapsed. What happened next was so sudden that the Turkish emissaries barely had time to process. Vlad raised his right hand, a simple gesture, almost delicate, but that movement had the weight of a sentence. In an instant, Wallachian guards emerged from the shadows like specters, surrounding the Turks with precise and rehearsed movements. The ambassadors tried to react, their hands moving instinctively to where their weapons would be, but they carried no swords at that diplomatic audience. They had entered the palace as emissaries of peace, protected by the sacred laws of hospitality and diplomacy that governed even the most brutal of medieval wars. But they were in the court of Vlad Tepes, and there, the rules were written in blood. The guards did not wound them, did not knock them down, did not draw swords. Instead, with an efficiency that suggested prior rehearsal, they held the Turks by the arms and shoulders, immobilizing them without excessive violence. It was a firm, but almost respectful restraint, and this contradiction made everything even more disturbing. Vlad walked slowly around the captured emissaries, observing them like a craftsman examines his raw material before beginning work. His voice, when it emerged again, maintained that low and controlled tone that was more terrifying than any scream. He spoke about traditions, about the importance of honoring the customs of ancestors, about how noble it was that the Turks maintained their practices even in foreign lands. And then he declared, with a logic as twisted as it was impeccable, that it would be his honor to help them maintain that sacred tradition. If the turbans should never be removed, then they never would be. He personally would guarantee that. It was at that moment that the emissaries understood the fatal error they had committed. They were not negotiating with a conventional Christian prince. They were not before a European noble who followed the chivalrous codes of honor and diplomacy. They were in the presence of something different, something that had been forged in Turkish prisons, tempered in hatred and sharpened in revenge. The guards brought hammers and nails, not the crude instruments of common carpentry, but smaller, precise tools the kind used for delicate work in metal or wood, the kind that could pierce fabric and flesh with surgical efficiency. The terror in the Turks' eyes was palpable now. One of them tried to speak, invoke treaties, remind of the consequences of such an act. But his voice came out trembling, broken by the fear that had finally shattered the facade of Ottoman superiority. He spoke of war, of the Sultan's revenge, of the army that would come and reduce Wallachia to ashes. Vlad heard everything with an impassive expression. When the Turk finished, the prince simply responded that he anxiously awaited the arrival of that army, that the plains of Wallachia were vast and could accommodate many stakes, that he was certain he would find space for every Turkish soldier who dared cross the Danube. Then he nodded, and the work began. The guards held the first emissary firmly while another approached with hammer and nail. The Turk struggled, but it was useless. Strong hands kept him immobile while the nail was positioned over the crimson fabric of the turban, pressed against the skull. The first hammer blow echoed through the hall like thunder. The sound of metal piercing fabric, hair, skin, and finally bone created a grotesque symphony that made even some Wallachian guards look away. The Turk's scream was muffled by hands that covered his mouth, but the sound still leaked through the gaps, a high-pitched and animal moan that spoke of pain that transcended the physical. One nail, then another, and one more. 3 nails in total, forming a triangle around the head, fixing the turban to the skull with a permanence that was both symbolic and literal. The crimson fabric began to darken as blood spread, creating irregular patterns that looked like macabre arabesques. The second emissary tried to flee. It was a desperate and futile attempt, his feet slipping on the polished stone while guards pursued him with the patience of experienced hunters. They caught him before he even reached the door, dragging him back to the center of the hall where his fate was already sealed. This one screamed louder than the first. His pleas in Turkish mixed with invocations to Allah, promises of riches, appeals to the mercy of a man who had long abandoned such a concept. Vlad watched everything with the same neutral expression, as if he were watching a moderately interesting theatrical play. The nails penetrated the second Turk's skull with the same brutal efficiency. 1, 2, 3. With each hammer blow, the man's body contorted in involuntary spasms, his muscles reacting to the trauma in a primordial way. Blood ran down his face, mixing with tears and sweat, creating red streams that dripped onto the stone floor. The third emissary, seeing the fate of his companions, did something unexpected. He stopped fighting, became completely motionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the palace walls. Perhaps he was praying. Perhaps he was mentally disconnecting from the horror he was about to experience. Or perhaps he had simply understood the futility of resistance. When the guards approached him, the Turk spoke. His voice was low but firm, each word pronounced with a dignity that contrasted violently with the situation. He said that Mehmed the Great would never forget this, that the Sultan had conquered Constantinople, the city that had resisted for 1,000 years, and that Wallachia was nothing compared to that Vlad had signed not only his death sentence, but that of his entire people. Vlad approached then, standing face to face with the emissary. For a brief moment, something passed between them, a recognition perhaps. 2 men trapped in power games much larger than themselves, executing their roles in a drama being written by empires and religions. But the moment passed, and Vlad stepped back, giving space for the guards to do their work. The nails pierced the last turban with the same methodical precision. This time the Turk did not scream. He only closed his eyes and clenched his teeth, enduring the pain in silence, refusing to give the Wallachian prince the satisfaction of hearing him beg. It was a last act of defiance, small and futile, but an act nonetheless. When everything was finished, the 3 emissaries remained standing, sustained by guards, their turbans now permanently fixed to their heads by iron nails that pierced flesh and bone. Blood ran from their wounds, staining their elegant garments, transforming symbols of pride into marks of humiliation. Vlad returned to his throne, sitting with the same composure as before, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. He looked at the mutilated Turks and spoke, his voice echoing through the hall in impeccable Turkish. He said they had declared that their traditions were too sacred to be broken, and that he, as a hospitable host, had honored that tradition. The turbans would never leave their heads. They could return to the Sultan and report that the voivode of Wallachia deeply respected Ottoman customs. The irony was as heavy as the iron nails. The emissaries understood then that they were not just victims of brutality, but also of a carefully constructed message. Each nail was a word in that message. Each drop of blood was punctuation, and the message was clear. Wallachia would not bow. The guards led them out of the palace, still bleeding, still staggering from pain and shock. Horses were provided, and somehow, through a fog of agony, the three men mounted. Their elegant garments were ruined, their faces pale from blood loss, but their turbans remained firmly in place, nailed to their heads like crowns of iron and pain. The journey back to Ottoman territory was a walking nightmare. The three emissaries rode in silence, each movement of the head provoking waves of pain that radiated from the pierced skull. Blood had coagulated around the nails, creating grotesque scabs that pulled at the skin with each gesture. Some inhabitants of Wallachian villages who saw them pass crossed themselves, whispering prayers and averting their gaze from that profane sight. They crossed the frozen plains, passed through dark forests, where wolves howled in the distance, crossed rivers whose icy water made their bodies tremble uncontrollably. And throughout the journey, the turbans remained, those symbols of pride transformed into instruments of torture, constant reminders of the humiliation they had suffered. When they finally reached Ottoman territory, news of their fate had already preceded them. Merchants crossing the border had spread rumors, each version more grotesque than the last. They said that the impaler had done something unimaginable, that he had profaned not only bodies but sacred symbols, that he had declared war not only on the Sultan but on the Islamic faith itself. The emissaries were taken directly to the presence of Mehmed, the Conqueror, he who had humiliated the Byzantine Empire and broken the last bastion of Eastern Christianity, observed the men returning from their diplomatic mission. He saw the bloodied turbans, the iron nails shining under the lantern light, the pale faces marked by pain. The throne room in Adrianople became absolutely silent. Counselors, viziers, generals, all were paralyzed before that vision. It was not just the brutality of the act that shocked, but its implication. Vlad had taken a sacred symbol, a mark of religious and cultural identity, and transformed it into an instrument of humiliation. It was a challenge that could not be ignored. Mehmed, known for his volatile temperament and wounded pride, surprised everyone present with his reaction. He did not explode in rage, did not order immediate preparations for war. Instead, he approached the emissaries, observed Vlad's work closely, and then something strange happened. He smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile, the kind of expression a chess player displays upon perceiving his opponent's strategy. The Sultan understood that Vlad was not simply being cruel. He was sending a message coded in blood and iron. He was saying that he knew the Ottomans, that he had learned from them, that he would not be intimidated by their power. He was essentially declaring that he preferred to die in flames than live on his knees. And Mehmed, who had conquered Constantinople at 21, who had transformed the Ottoman Empire into the greatest power in the world, recognized something in Vlad's gesture. He recognized an equal. Not in power or resources, but in will, in pure, inflexible, obstinate will. But recognition does not mean forgiveness. And in the implacable logic of empires, challenges must be answered. Vlad's message had been received, understood, and now would be answered. Not with haste, not with blind rage, but with the inevitability of a storm forming on the horizon. The Sultan ordered that the emissaries be treated, that doctors remove the nails and care for the wounds, but the scars would remain, both physical and symbolic. Every time those men touched their heads, they would feel the marks left by the impaler. And every time the Sultan saw them, he would remember the small Wallachian prince who dared defy him. In the weeks that followed, Ottoman messengers began traveling through the empire, carrying orders, mobilizing resources, gathering armies. The Ottoman war machine, That which had crushed crusaders and defeated empires began to move, and its destination was Wallachia. But Vlad was already expecting that. He knew from the moment he ordered the first nails that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had transformed a diplomatic matter into a declaration of war, had traded the possibility of peace for the certainty of conflict. And he had done it consciously, deliberately, because for him some things were more important than survival. Dignity was one of them. The refusal to bow was another. But was there something more behind that apparently suicidal gesture? Did Vlad have a plan that went beyond simple provocation? And what did that act reveal about the true nature of the man that history would remember as the Impaler? What official history recorded as an isolated act of barbarism actually hid layers of meaning that only careful analysis of period documents can reveal? And here we begin to unearth the truth that school textbooks preferred to silence. In the libraries of the University of Bucharest, Romanian archivists preserve manuscripts that cast different light on the episode of the nailed turbans. Among them, Saxon chronicles written by eyewitnesses who lived in Vlad's court, records that were systematically ignored by Western historians for centuries. The most revealing document was discovered in 1968 by Romanian historian Constantin Rezacevici. It is a commercial letter written by a Venetian merchant named Giacomo di Promontorio, dated 1461, just 2 years after the incident. In it, Promontorio describes a conversation he had with one of Vlad's counselors, a man identified only as Nikolai, the scribe. According to the account, Nikolai revealed that Vlad's gesture was not an impulse of cruelty, but calculated strategy. The Wallachian prince knew that Wallachia, squeezed between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, survived only while the great powers remained in balance. But Mehmed was becoming too powerful, and Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, his supposed ally, showed signs of wanting to negotiate peace with the Turks. For Vlad, that was unacceptable. A peace between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire would mean that Wallachia would be sacrificed, transformed into a Turkish province, or divided between the two empires. He needed to prevent that alliance, needed to make war inevitable, and nothing would guarantee that better than a provocation so extreme that no subsequent negotiation could erase it. The nailed turbans were not gratuitous cruelty. They were diplomacy through horror, a coded message that said, "There is no return, no middle ground. There will be only total war." And in that war, Wallachia would fight alongside Hungary because there would be no other choice. But there was another dimension to Vlad's gesture, one that has to do with his own history. Historian Kurt Treptow from the University of Bucharest spent decades studying Vlad's years of captivity in the Ottoman court. In his book, published in 2000, Treptow presents evidence that the young prince was subjected to humiliation rituals designed to break his spirit and transform him into an obedient vassal. Among these rituals, there are references in Turkish chronicles to a specific episode. Vlad would have been forced to watch the execution of Christian prisoners, and when he refused to look away, Ottoman soldiers held him and forced him to keep his eyes open. The humiliation was not only in what he saw, but in the impossibility of closing his eyes, of denying himself that vision. The nailed turbans were the inverted mirror of that humiliation. If the Turks had forced his eyes to remain open, he now forced their symbols to remain fixed. It was a symbolic revenge that transcended the present moment and reached into Vlad's own traumatic past. But the story becomes even more complex when we analyze the different versions of the episode that circulated through medieval Europe. The German version of the events, preserved in printed pamphlets that circulated throughout the Holy Roman Empire, presents a radically different narrative. In these texts, the emissaries are not Turks, but Florentines, Italian merchants who refused to remove their hats before Vlad as a demonstration of republican superiority. This discrepancy is not accidental. The German pamphlets were mass-produced after 1463, when Vlad had already fallen into political disgrace and was imprisoned in Hungary. Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king who should have been his ally, had political interest in portraying him as an uncontrolled tyrant to justify his imprisonment and appropriation of papal funds destined for the crusade against the Turks. By transforming the victims from Turks to Florentines, the German pamphlets completely changed the meaning of the act. It was no longer a gesture of resistance against Islamic oppressors, but an irrational attack against Western Christians, against representatives of commerce and civilization. It was political propaganda disguised as historical account. Professor Radu Florescu, Romanian-American historian from Boston University, dedicated 40 years to the study of these documentary contradictions. In his works, he demonstrates how Vlad's image was systematically distorted by contemporary political interests. The Germans portrayed him as a monster because they had commercial conflicts with Wallachia. The Hungarians defamed him to justify their betrayal. And the Turks, curiously, showed more respect for their enemy than his supposed Christian allies. In Ottoman chronicles, preserved in the archives of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, there is a description of the incident written by chronicler Tursun Beg, who served under Mehmed. His account confirms that the emissaries were indeed Turks, and that the incident occurred exactly as Romanian sources describe. But Tursun adds a crucial detail. Mehmed would have said that Vlad was a man who understood the meaning of honor better than many Muslims. This praise, coming from the conquering Sultan himself, reveals something profound. Mehmed recognized in Vlad not a barbarian, but an equal, someone who played the same power game with the same brutal rules that the Ottoman Empire itself had established. Respect was born, not despite the cruelty, but because of the implacable consistency with which Vlad applied his principles. But there is yet another layer to this story, one that has to do with the very concept of the turban in medieval Islamic culture. Research by anthropologist Michael Ursinus from Heidelberg University demonstrates that the turban was not just clothing, but had profound religious significance. Removing the turban in enemy territory was considered spiritual submission, not just political. By nailing the turbans, Vlad was not just torturing bodies. He was making a theological declaration. He was saying that not even the Islamic faith would have supremacy in his territory. It was an act of defiance that transcended politics and reached the metaphysical, transforming those three men into involuntary martyrs of a conflict between civilizations. But the question that historians avoid asking is this: why did Vlad need such provocation? What did he really hope to achieve with an act that would inevitably bring a Turkish army to his borders? The answer lies in military documents that only recently have been analyzed with proper attention. In the archive of the Order of the Dragon, maintained in the Vatican Library, there are correspondences between Vlad and his cousin Stephen the Great of Moldavia, dated from the months preceding the turban incident. In these letters, written in medieval Romanian and translated by historian Maria Holban in the 70s, Vlad details an audacious plan. He did not just want to defend Wallachia, he wanted to launch a preventive offensive against the Ottoman Empire, cross the Danube, and cause such devastation in the Balkans that Mehmed would be forced to divert resources from his other conquests. But for such a plan to work, Vlad needed two things: military support from Hungary and moral justification in the eyes of Christianity. The turban incident served both purposes. By provoking the Turks so extremely, he forced Matthias Corvinus to choose a side, making any peace agreement impossible. And at the same time, he created a narrative of Christian resistance against Islamic oppression that could mobilize papal support and resources for a crusade. It was manipulation on a continental scale. Each nail hammered into a Turkish skull was also a nail in the construction of a larger military alliance. Vlad was betting that his brutality would be interpreted not as madness, but as Christian heroism. And for a time, it worked. Pope Pius II, in a papal bull of 1462, referred to Vlad as valiant prince and defender of the faith. Letters were sent to European courts requesting financial and military support for Wallachia. Vlad had managed to transform an act of terror into effective propaganda, but there was a problem he did not foresee. Matthias Corvinus was more interested in papal gold than in holy war. When Vlad finally launched his campaign across the Danube in the winter of 1462, massacring thousands of Turks and Bulgarians in one of the most brutal campaigns in medieval history, Matthias did not send the promised reinforcements. Worse still, when Vlad retreated to Wallachia pursued by Mehmed's army, Matthias imprisoned him under forged charges of conspiracy with the Turks. The same letters that Vlad had sent asking for help were used as evidence of treason, and the prince who had sacrificed everything for the Christian cause was thrown into a Hungarian prison where he would spend the next 12 years. The irony was bitter. The nailed turbans, intended to force an alliance, ended up destroying it. Vlad had calculated all possible reactions except the simplest one, pure and shameless betrayal by his supposed ally. But was all this really just political strategy? Or was there something more personal, more visceral in Vlad's hatred of the Turks? To understand the depth of that hatred, we need to return to the years from 1442 to 1448, when Vlad and his brother Radu were held as hostages in the Ottoman court. Documents recently analyzed by historian Matei Cazacu from the Sorbonne cast disturbing light on those formative years. Vlad was only 11 years old when he was delivered to the Turks by his own father as a guarantee of loyalty. For 6 years, he lived in Egrigos and later in Adrianople, witnessing daily the power and sophistication of the empire that kept his homeland subjugated. But he also witnessed something darker. Turkish chronicles mention that the young Wallachian princes were subjected to an education program typical for sons of vassals. This program included not only teaching of Turkish language, religion, and customs, but also practical demonstrations of how the empire dealt with rebels and traitors. And the preferred method of execution was, not coincidentally, impalement. Vlad, the boy, would have witnessed dozens, perhaps hundreds of executions by impalement. He saw how the human body reacts to that prolonged agony, how some men took days to die, how the method was used not just to kill, but to terrorize. It was an education through horror, designed to shape obedient vassals who would never dare rebel. But with Vlad, the effect was inverse. Instead of submission, the experience generated a profound understanding that power in that world came not from kindness or justice, but from absolute fear. He learned the Ottoman lesson perfectly, but decided to apply it against his own teachers. His brother Radu had the opposite reaction. Documents show that he embraced Turkish culture, converted to Islam, and eventually fought alongside Mehmed against his own brother. The same experience created two completely different men, one who bowed, another who became unbreakable steel. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia after his father's death, murdered by treacherous boyars in 1447, he brought with him not only traumatic memories, but a complete manual of Ottoman techniques of control through terror, and he would apply these techniques with an efficiency that would shock even his former captors. The nailed turbans were just the most visible manifestation of a larger pattern. Vlad systematically used the methods he had learned from the Turks, but with an intensity that surpassed the original masters. It was as if he had spent 6 years studying at a university of horror, and now was applying his knowledge with academic perfection. But this psychological explanation, however convincing, does not fully capture the complexity of the man. Because Vlad was not just a product of trauma, he was also a brilliant strategist who understood that in his time, cruelty was political currency, and he was willing to pay any price. The final truth about the nailed turbans emerges when we unite all these fragments: diplomatic documents, psychological analyses, military and political context. And that truth is at once simpler and more disturbing than the legends suggest. Vlad Tepes was a man trapped in an impossible power game where all options led to destruction. Wallachia could not militarily defeat either the Ottoman Empire or the Kingdom of Hungary, could not negotiate from a position of strength, could not trust allies who saw it only as a sacrificable piece on the geopolitical board. The only weapon Vlad possessed was absolute unpredictability. He needed to be so brutal, so intransigent, so completely terrible that no empire would dare presume they could control him. The nailed turbans were a declaration. I am more dangerous as an ally than as an enemy, because I have no limits. It was a desperate gamble by a desperate man, and for some years it worked. Mehmed, who had conquered Constantinople, retreated before the forest of impaled that Vlad created. Matthias, who controlled one of the largest armies in Europe, hesitated to attack directly. Vlad's brutality created around him a zone of uncertainty that temporarily protected his small kingdom. But history has a cruel way of judging such men. What Vlad did not realize is that by crossing all lines of human decency, he became isolated. He had no true allies, only temporarily intimidated enemies. And when he finally fell, no one came to his defense, because no one really knew him beyond the mask of terror that he himself had created. The 3 Turkish emissaries with turbans nailed to their heads became symbols of this larger tragedy. They were at once victims of real cruelty and instruments of a desperate strategy. Their sufferings were both political and personal, both calculated and genuinely sadistic. And if this story teaches us anything, it is that history is rarely about villains and heroes. It is about men trapped in impossible circumstances, making choices they believe necessary, carrying traumas that shape their actions, and being judged by future generations who will never know the weight of their decisions. Vlad Tepes nailed turbans to human heads. This is documented historical fact. But the motives behind that act contain layers of meaning that range from personal revenge to geopolitical strategy, from childhood trauma to brutal pragmatism. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is this: in his context, in his time, his logic made sense. It was a monstrous logic, but it was logic. In the next chapter of Lost Legends, we will dive into the death of Dan III, where Vlad will face his greatest rival in a 9-day battle that would end with a funeral that Europe would never forget. Because sometimes how we treat our dead enemies reveals more about us than any act committed in life.